Hello, welcome to another video from the conscientious biologist, Ben Gallagher. This one's the third one in the disease playlist. It's the first one looking at communicable disease. So from the last two videos, you should be very confident in your understanding of what non-communicable diseases are. These are communicable diseases, which are spread by pathogens. So that's what we're looking at in this video. We're looking at the pathogens themselves, some examples of communicable diseases that you need to know, and some of the mechanisms by which those pathogens are transmitted. This is from the GCSE syllabus, and as always, please do subscribe to my channel on YouTube if you haven't done so already. Thank you. So we started the lessons on non-communicable disease by asking the question, what does non-communicable mean? Well, you should remember that the word communicable comes from communication, and communication is where a piece of information is passed from one person to another, so it can be passed between people. So non-communicable diseases can't be passed. Communicable diseases can. So communicable means something is passing from one person to another, and really importantly for disease, it makes them ill. So there's something that can't necessarily be seen, but it's going from one person to another and causing illness. Well, those somethings are called pathogens. Okay, there's various types of pathogens, but you can kind of group them together by using this word microorganism. So a pathogen is a microorganism that causes infection and illness or disease. Okay, so the pathogen's the thing that's actually passing between people. Now there's only really three main categories of pathogen that you need to know about: bacteria, viruses, and fungi. You need to know several examples of these though, which diseases can be are bacterial, which are viral, which are fungal. So what I've done, I've put a load of these into a table, and we're going to break it down and look at each one individually. What I've done, I've given you a load of examples, but the ones that I've marked in dark print, in the blacker print, those are the ones that you absolutely need to know. The other ones are kind of extra ones that might be quite useful to try and remember. They're the kind of information that's useful to drop into an answer to impress the examiner. But it's the ones in black that you absolutely need to know. So some bacterial diseases that you absolutely should have heard of is salmonella. You should have heard of salmonella. It's one of the key causes of food poisoning. It's just one of those kind of general knowledge bits of information. Agrobacteria I wouldn't expect you to have heard of, nor Neisseria gonorrhea. But that second bit of its name, gonorrhea, you've probably heard of that as a disease. Fungal infections, yeast is a really common fungal infection. Diplicatum rosea and trichophyton. Again, look, none of those are in dark black, so you don't need to know those. They're just useful examples to remember. Viruses, rubiola, I do want you to know that one, even though I've only marked it in grey, because of what it links up to, what I'll show you in a minute. But HIV, you definitely will have heard of and come across. HIV that's associated with AIDS, tobacco mosaic virus you probably haven't heard of, but you do need to know about it. And I've added to the bottom there, coronavirus, just because it's such a massive thing going on at the moment, at the time that I'm doing these videos. We've only recently kind of come out of lockdown, things have started to ease down, but it looks like we're starting the second wave at the moment. So coronavirus is a big thing at the moment. So I put it on this table. But let's open this table up to some of the extra information here. So there's a lot of information on this table. Remember, you don't need to know it all, but some of it you do have to know. So let's start at the top with salmonella. Well, salmonella leads to food poisoning. It's one of the most common bacteria that causes food poisoning. The symptom of that being vomiting and diarrhea. If you look, I'm linking them together with arrows, the ones that you need to know. Agrobacterium, I wouldn't expect you to have heard of. Sorry, we need to cover gonorrhea first. Gonorrhea, you just need to know its symptoms of that as a disease, which causes discharge and pain from the genitals. It's a sexually transmitted disease. It's that bacteria, the Neisseria bacteria, that can be passed from person to person through sex. It's a very nasty, very painful condition, but it can be cured because it's a bacteria. It can be cured with antibiotics. Jumping down to agrobacterium then. So this is one that affects plants, and it causes these things called plant galls. Now I'm going to give you a picture of plant galls because I doubt you've come across them before, or particularly stopped to think of what they are. If you look at the leaves of some plants, you can see they've got kind of bumps growing over the leaves. Those are galls, okay? And plant galls are just the lumps on the stem, the trunk, or the leaf caused by this bacteria, kind of messing up the cells and making these lumps grow. You need to know those three parts for that one. There's agrobacterium causing plant galls, which are lumps on the stem or the trunk or leaf. Relatively harmless to the plant itself though. We're looking at fungi ones, and the only one on there that you really need to know anything about is the rose black spot fungus. And what the rose black spot fungus does is it causes black spots, leaf loss, and slow growth of the plants. Now think about that, link that up to your prior knowledge. This is a fungus that makes patches of the leaf just go black. Well, think why that would make slower growth and be bad for the plant. The leaves do the photosynthesis. The photosynthesis is done by chlorophyll, the green colour in the leaves. So if this fungus is destroying the chlorophyll and turning patches of the leaves black, they're no longer photosynthetic. That means they're not going to be making glucose, so the plant isn't getting the glucose to do the respiration to get the energy to grow. So it's quite a nasty condition that can kill rose bushes. Jumping down then to the viral examples you need to know. So the reason why I put rubeola on there and why I want you to know that as a name is because it's the virus that causes measles. Measles causes a fever and a rash and can be fatal. It's something we've had vaccines for a long time, and the number of measles cases internationally dramatically reduced after the introduction of vaccine. Sadly, cases globally of measles are going back up again because there's a big anti-vaccine movement, and because there's now fewer people being vaccinated, cases are starting to go back up, and there are fatalities associated with that, of course. But you do need to know measles is a viral disease. I'd like you to also know it's caused by the rubeola virus. HIV and AIDS you need to know in full. Now lots of people get this confused and they think HIV and AIDS are the same thing. HIV is the virus. It stands for human immunosuppressive virus. Okay, it's a virus that infects your immune cells and can destroy them. Now, if your immune cells are destroyed, you can no longer fight disease. So your immune system is deficient. It's not working. That's where the AIDS name comes from, because AIDS is acquired, meaning you've caught it, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Okay, so HIV virus destroys your white blood cells, your immune response, so you acquire an immunodeficiency, you can't fight things off. So people die from AIDS because they catch a separate illness that, because they no longer have a functional immune system, they can't fight it off, and they die from a disease that they should have been able to fight off. Thankfully, lots and lots of research over the last couple of decades have made antiviral drugs for HIV. That means now you can catch HIV and it's no longer the kind of death sentence it was 20 or 30 years ago. You can have a normal life expectancy with HIV by taking drugs to keep the virus under control, which is great news. Next one on there, the tobacco mosaic virus. Let's just put the arrows in for those ones. Tobacco mosaic virus, this is another plant one, causes, the disease is just a TMV infection, tobacco mosaic virus infection. That leads to discoloured leaves and slow growths in tobacco plants. If you look at the leaf above my head, same kind of thing with the rose black spot above it. If you're destroying the leaves' photosynthetic ability, the plants aren't going to grow as much. This is really bad for people who manufacture tobacco for cigarettes and smoking and things like that, because they can lose huge amounts of their crop. And again, you need to know that's a viral related disease. So lots of information on there. It's just stuff to memorize though. Okay, it's nothing particularly interesting, but you need to know which conditions go with which pathogen. You need to know that pathogens are bacteria, fungi, and virus. There's one extra one I'm going to introduce here, which is a protista. If you remember, we talked ages ago back in the cell biology lessons at the start of phase 1. We talked about the 5 kingdoms of life. Okay, you've got your prokaryotes, your bacteria, but then with your eukaryotic groups, you've got plants, animals, fungi, and protista. Okay, or protoctists, some people call them. Some of those can act as pathogens as well. For example, the one I've put on here, the Plasmodium protoctist, and notice it's in black. This is one you need to know. The Plasmodium protoctist is the one that causes malaria. Awful condition that kills thousands and thousands and thousands of people on the planet every year. Symptoms of malaria: fever, tiredness, death, and that's because the red blood cells are destroyed by the Plasmodium protoctist. If your red blood cells are destroyed, they can't carry oxygen around your body. So your cells will start to starve of oxygen. If enough of them die and you get seriously ill, then your whole body will die. So that's a really bad one, caused by a protista as a pathogen, but most pathogens are those first 3: bacteria, fungi, and virus. Just as an extra thing to mention, parasites are a separate kind of category. Parasites can get into your body, they can make you very, very ill, but they're not generally classed as pathogens. Parasites are organisms that live on or in an organism of another species. So the parasite species will live in another organism, which is called the host, from the body of which it obtains nutriment. Nutrient meaning sort of nutrition that it can get hold of. Okay, so things like a tapeworm that can get into your insides, can live in your guts, can live in your small intestine, sucks up and absorbs your nutrition from your gut, from the food that you've eaten, can make you ill. There can be symptoms, but it's not technically classed as a pathogen. Okay, so lots of information on this slide, lots of stuff to learn. I suggest take a screenshot of this because it's just a case of memorizing this. Okay, just 2 more slides on this presentation because that first one had huge amounts of information. First one is on pathogen transmission. Now, transmission refers to the different ways that pathogens can be passed from one person to another. In other words, we could say how it is transmitted. So how's that virus transmitted? How's that bacteria passed on? That's what transmission is. There's only really 4 main groups of transmission that you need to know about. The first one is airborne, or by airborne droplets. So we've got our guy over here sneezing. They've taken a quick flash photo against a black background, and you can see how much is spraying out of this guy's mouth. But those are airborne droplets. That's droplets of saliva and mucus that have been blasted out into the air. It's because some pathogens need to still stay in sort of droplets in a moist environment, and someone else will breathe in those tiny droplets that have been expelled by that person in a sneeze. Some pathogens, though, don't need that droplet. They can just float around in the air. So things like fungal spores. A fungus could just erupt, give off its spores, and they float around in the air, and you could inhale them and get ill from that. COVID-19 that we've got at the moment, the coronavirus, that's an airborne pathogen. It just floats around in the air, and if you're close to people breathing it out, you can breathe that in and catch it. Okay, so airborne, probably the worst one, because you can't really escape the air. That's the worst thing for pathogens because they can spread very easily from them. Second one is direct contact. This is where you have to sort of physically be in contact with someone or perhaps something they've recently touched to pick the pathogen up directly off them. This group also includes things like sexually transmitted infections, where people, when they're having sex, could be passing diseases back and forth, generally through body fluids. So with sexually transmitted infections, it's normally in semen, but it could just be in blood-to-blood contact. So if you've got someone who's got a cut, you've got a small cut on your hand and you're trying to fix the cut on their face and it's blood to blood, pathogens can go from blood to blood. But of course, again, that has to be by direct contact. Okay. Third one, this is pretty nasty one, pretty worrying. This is through waterborne or by ingestion. So this could be if you're drinking dirty water, contaminated water, which loads of people all over the world do have to, of course, they don't have a choice. Or if you're eating foods that are contaminated, either they've started to go a bit rotten, so they've got bacteria growing in them, or maybe it's just food that, you know, maybe someone sneezed near it, or maybe there was just some pathogens floating around and landed on it. But if you eat or drink anything that contains pathogens, those are obviously getting directly and immediately inside you. So you've got to be careful with waterborne pathogens and of course pathogens on anything that you eat. The last one is by vector. So this is a bit of a strange one. This links up to the malaria one that we looked at a minute ago. Malaria's got a bit of a strange life cycle, those Plasmodium protista, in that they grow inside a mosquito, and when an infected mosquito bites you, they can inject them into your blood, give you malaria. The protista can multiply in your body, in your liver and in your blood. Then another mosquito could come and bite you, suck out some of your blood. They've then got the malaria in them. They go and bite someone else and pass that to them. So a vector is an in-between. It's a carrier that can pick up disease from one place and pass it to somewhere else. So airborne droplets, direct contact, water and ingestion, and vectors. Those are the main ways that pathogens spread from person to person. Okay, last one, quite straightforward, this one about reducing pathogen transmission. We actually don't want to get ill from any of these things, and we've seen there's lots of ways that pathogens can pass from one person to another. But what we can do is make behavioural changes, things that we do in our day-to-day lives to try and reduce the risk of pathogen transmission and making us ill. So the first one of these is pretty obvious, and people are being told to do this all the time at the moment. It's just improved hygiene practices. Some of the most simple ones: wash your hands, keep your hands clean, because if there's airborne infections floating about and they float onto your hands, they could float anywhere on your body. But we tend to touch our mouths with our hands. We pick things up, we put things in our mouths using our hands. So your hands are going to be a major thing attracting and spreading any pathogens that are around. If you keep your hands washed, wash them properly and often, or you use hand sanitizer, that should destroy any pathogens on your hands, which will stop them spreading to you and anything or anyone that you might touch. So that's a really, really sensible behavioural change we should make. But what's strange is this wasn't always done. It wasn't always known. This guy I'm putting up now, this is one of my heroes. This guy's called Ignaz Semmelweis. He was a doctor working in the 1850s. And one of the things I love about him is he just made intelligent observations. He looked at things and he thought about them. And what he realised was a lot of his students that he was training to be doctors, having done dissections on dead bodies, on human bodies, on people who had died of things, maybe from infection, people would sort of operate on them, do their dissections, maybe wipe their hands off, but then would go to the patients and start dealing with their patients. Now, to us, we'd go, well, that's disgusting that their hands would be covered in germs. But back then, they didn't really know about germs. They hadn't really thought up germ theory because they didn't have powerful microscopes like we do now. So germs to them were totally invisible, unknown things. Now, what Ignaz Semmelweis did, why he was so amazing, is he made a link between his students who didn't wash their hands between dealing with dead bodies and the deaths after childbirth of mothers. His students were going to help these mothers give birth during their labour. The baby would be born, and quite often he'd see that the mother and quite often the child would both die of infection at some point relatively soon after birth. So he thought, well, hang on, maybe their infection is somehow being carried from the dead bodies. Maybe there's something, didn't know it was germs, didn't know it was pathogens, but something being carried by his students to the women. So he looked at the women who had given birth just with the help of midwives who hadn't been anywhere near the dead bodies. And he looked at it and he worked out that most of the women who only had a midwife helping them during birth didn't get an infection and survived, whereas quite a significant number of the ones that his students who had been dealing with dead bodies did get an infection. So he thought, well, hang on, that seems to be a big link. So he got all his students to start washing their hands and really sanitizing themselves properly. And he noticed that the rate of deaths of the mothers who his students had helped dramatically reduced. Now, that should have been really obvious to everyone then, right? There's something being passed on. However, loads of people were massively opposed to Ignaz Semmelweis, because think about what he's saying. He's saying there's some invisible thing that doctors are carrying from one person to another. This invisible thing that no one can see, no one can identify, no one can look at. But he's saying this is killing people. And effectively in saying that, he's saying it's the doctor's fault that these people are dying. They are carrying something invisible that no one can see from one person to another, and they're killing their patients. So as you can imagine, loads of doctors fiercely argued against him, but he still persevered, he pushed on through, and he was a real leader in improved hygiene practices. Now, Ignaz Semmelweis is on your course. You do need to know about him. You need to know about his name. You could be asked in the exam information about what he did or how he contributed to germ theory. So make sure you've listened to that and understood that. One last one on improved hygiene practices is something really simple. When you sneeze or cough, cough into a tissue and throw it away. Catch it, bin it, kill it. That was a big slogan a while ago. Because if you're sneezing into a tissue, all those airborne droplets aren't going to fly around. You throw it away, you sanitize your hands. It's a much better practice. Let's look at a second behavioral change then, using physical barriers. Things like masks. So loads of people at the moment are wearing masks. They're mandatory on public transport and things like that, because if you've got a mask in front of your face, there's less droplets, less pathogen particles are going to be breathed out by you that can float into the air. And if everyone's doing it, they're not going to be spreading things around as much. So masks are a physical barrier, brilliant for airborne things. But think about sexually transmitted diseases as well. Something as simple as a condom can be a physical barrier to viruses like the HIV virus. So any physical barrier, depending on the mechanism of transmission, but a physical barrier against the spread of the pathogen is always going to be a good idea. Next one, food storage and preparation. We said about waterborne infections and contaminated foods and things like that. Well, nowadays, we're very, very educated and we're very intelligent about how we treat our food. So we know that if we get food, to keep it fresh, to keep it healthy and clean, we put it in the fridge or we put it in the freezer. We put it in airtight containers to stop anything from the air getting into it. We keep the temperature down to reduce the growth of any microbes. So we know how to store our food to minimize the risk of pathogen growth. And everything has best before dates and use by dates and things like that. Those dates that you see on packaging correlate to bacterial growth. So someone in a lab somewhere had that bit of food and measured the amount of bacteria on it and went, right, if that's left for like 9 days, the bacterial level gets high enough that it could be harmful to the person eating it. So put the use by date as a couple of days before then. It might be with some foods, oh, that takes 2 years for enough bacteria or pathogens to grow and build up on it to be harmful. So that can have a really, really long use by date. But it's about how you store them. Also with hygiene and food preparation in kitchens now, lots of sort of industrial kitchens or kitchens in pubs and restaurants and things like that. It's all stainless steel. It can be cleaned really easily, disinfected. So we're really, really strict about food preparation. Food gets cooked really properly now. We all know about cooking chicken and turkey really thoroughly so you don't get food poisoning off it. So food storage and preparation has massively decreased the rate of transmission of diseases. Also included in things like this about how you treat water. If you go abroad somewhere and you're having to drink from a water source that you just don't know how clean it is, you boil the water really, really thoroughly to kill any pathogens that might be in it, or you might put it through a filter. But how we treat our food and drink and how we prepare it is essential to keeping ourselves healthy. Last one, if you've got a vector spread infection, you need to do things to control or destroy the vectors. Now, the only one you really need to know about is the malaria one. Malaria is spread by mosquitoes as the vector. So you use things like this, a mosquito net. If you're going somewhere where there's lots of mosquitoes, sleep under a mosquito net. Use insect repellent, spray yourself with it to keep the mosquitoes off you so they're not going to bite you. There's lots of ways that you can destroy or get rid of the mosquitoes so that they don't attack you. Of course, where there's ponds and things where mosquitoes tend to breed very, very heavily, sometimes people actually go out and treat the water or put a layer of oil on the top so the mosquito larvae can't climb out and get out. So there's ways sort of en masse that you can affect it. But simple changes like repellent and mosquito nets is a good way to keep yourself safe. So this is pretty much it. These are the common sense ways of reducing pathogen transmission. So take a screenshot of this one. Hopefully you did it the last one as well. And that's it for this video. So from here, head to disease 4, which is still looking at communicable disease. Everything in the rest of this unit is all communicable disease. But the next one looks at your body's own barriers to infection. So we're not talking now about things like mosquito nets and masks and condoms and things like that. We're talking about your body's natural evolved barriers to try and minimize pathogens from getting into you and making you ill. Hopefully you've enjoyed that. That was straightforward, lots of information in it, not the most exciting video to have watched, but if you enjoyed it, please do give it a like, subscribe to my YouTube channel, have a look over on my Facebook page as well if you're on Facebook. There's loads of extra biological information there to supplement your learning. Thank you.